particular, I'm very pleased to speak at this historic institution as a professor of history. At this institution that has nearly 100 years of history. I was just reading a little bit about this wonderful organization, and isn't it appropriate, of course, that this subject and this time, March being Women's History Month, and this building and this group to speak about Faith Whittlesey. Each year I teach my students about the Seneca Falls Convention, 1848, and the statement that all men and women are created equal, so it's really nice to have a chance to talk about this woman, Faith Whittlesey, who I spent so much time writing about. I was also pleased to see many people here tonight. Some of the people I interviewed, like Susan Graff, who's in front here, and the editor of the book, Kelly Waring, is even here, so he can tell you the sort of backstory behind some of this, some of it as we put this together. So it's really, really wonderful to have you all here. Since there are many mothers in the room, I just wanted to, if you'll indulge me, read a section which kind of encapsulates some of the challenges that Faith Whittlesey confronted in her time in the White House of this story we're from. So it starts, chapter 4 begins like this. William, stand up. Here comes the Vice President. Faith Whittlesey urgently called out to her 10-year-old son as Vice President George H.W. Bush approached her office. As had become her custom, she brought William for an early breakfast to her new workplace's restaurant, known affectionately as the White House Mess. And this was in the West Wing of the White House. In early January 1983, Whittlesey had accepted a position on President Ronald Reagan's senior staff. Her office on the second floor provided her with exceptional proximity to the president. In order to prepare for her 8 a.m. meetings with President Reagan's chief of staff, James Baker, and other members of the White House senior staff, she needed to arrive early. As a widow and a single mother, she resolved to spend quality time with William by bringing him with her to the mess, where they would have breakfast together prior to her early morning senior staff meeting. Then she would take him into the parking lot and drive him to school. Faith struggled with the adjustment from ambassador in tranquil Bern to White House senior staff person. It was like jumping on board a train going 90 miles an hour, she recalled. Physically drained from the move, she caught a bad flu, which lingered the entire winter. Little sympathy came from her colleagues. Nobody understands sickness there, she said. You're not allowed to be sick. The pace of life is so fast, working from 7 or 8 in the morning until late at night. On several of these nights in the White House, she would receive a call from William at home. He would ask her, Mommy, when are you coming home? When she did return home, she often continued to work and fell asleep in her clothes. William would plead plaintively, Mommy, tune in. So these are some of the challenges that she was undergoing those 2 stressful years in the White House, and then she did return to Bern. So Faith Whittlesey will talk more afterwards, but I did want to do a few things here today. I wanted to first explain the title of the book to you, and then also to talk a little bit about her, maybe the most challenging part of her life, when she was able to achieve political status and the struggles in her early years, and then a little bit about her time as ambassador and in the White House. So this photo here I'll explain a little bit later, but this is on Air Force One in Geneva when she was ambassador with President Ronald Reagan. And the title came when she was speaking on behalf of President Reagan to the Teamsters Union. And if you're familiar with the Teamsters Union, of course, it's a truck drivers union, and they were, unions typically aren't Republican Party constituencies, but the Reagan administration was trying to appeal to the Teamsters Union. And President Reagan had asked Faith Whittlesey to speak to the union, and she was the honored speaker there, and trying to recruit this kind of working class constituency for the Republican Party. So facing that hard-boiled, overwhelmingly male audience of truck drivers, she assured them that a woman could demonstrate the resilience that they respected and admired. After mentioning that many people had questioned her ability to keep pace as a widowed mother of 3 children and the sole woman on the President's senior White House staff, Faith uttered her most memorable quotation. Remember, Ginger Rogers did everything that Fred Astaire did, only backwards and in high heels. And the quotation, the origins of the quotation are somewhat unclear, but Faith Whittlesey was the one that popularized the quotation. And I've seen this in sociology textbooks, in feminist works, and in places. It's become sort of a feminist mantra, and which is somewhat ironic because Faith Whittlesey probably wouldn't characterize herself as a feminist, but certainly embodies some of the characteristics that are admired by feminists. And if, of course, I'm assuming that you're familiar with this duo of Ginger Rogers and Fred Astaire, but the message was clear to, I think, the Teamsters audience that the 1930s musicals were perhaps in their line of vision, that sometimes men appeared to lead, but the women were often doing more than merely imitating the steps. So I think if we were to consider the pantheon of women in politics as is done in this Women's History Month, I think Faith Whittlesey has really been underappreciated and unrecognized and belongs a place there. Of course, there's Eleanor Roosevelt and Hillary Clinton are recognized, and in partnership with their husbands, they did rise to positions of prominence. And Faith Whittlesey also had a partnership with her husband, and he was in politics. But even after her husband's death, she achieved some of her most remarkable accomplishments after 1974. Faith Whittlesey won election to the Pennsylvania House of Representatives in 1972, and she was in a district dominated by our Republican Party establishment, an old boys network. It was called the War Board. The War Board, right? Not a name a woman might have chosen, right? But the War Board. And she was able to break into that and become one of, at that time, there were only 5% of women in state legislatures nationwide. Of course, 10 years before that, she was one of 6 in her law school class, and she earned a law degree at the time, and this wasn't a common, only a minority of women were achieving that feat. Her campaign attracted outsiders, young college students, suburban women, and this sort of anti-establishment or non-establishment approach actually became in the mode at the time because this was the time of Watergate, and this was the time of Richard Nixon, when the Republican Party and the established Republican Party wasn't as popular. So it was okay in that time to be a little bit anti-establishment, as Ronald Reagan would be. She campaigned in 1973 with, as I say here, kind of a 2-for-1. She was noticeably pregnant and she gave birth 2 weeks before the election. So her third son, William, was born 2 weeks before the election, and she took a few days off from the campaign. She then moved on to the Delaware County Council, where she was, along with her fellow lawyer and colleague, Charlie Keeler, she was one of these politicians that became Delaware County chairman, and Delaware County is as large or larger than some of the states in the United States, so this was a pretty prominent position. However, this sort of maverick approach, this non-establishment approach, did put her out of favor with some people, such as Drew Lewis in Pennsylvania and Arlen Specter, who were the Republican Party establishment. And in 1976, they were supporting President Gerald Ford for the election, not Republican Party nomination. But there was a fellow maverick named Ronald Reagan who was competing for the Republican Party nomination. Faith Whittlesey believed in him and supported him, in contrast to President Ford. The Republican Party establishment didn't appreciate that, and when President Ford did win, she did campaign for President Ford, and she did go out there as a loyal Republican and campaign for the president. But when she ran for lieutenant governor in 1978, the Republican Party leaders recruited a man named William Scranton. This is a good name for Pennsylvania politics, right? We have Scranton, Pennsylvania. And so this was the son also of a famous governor. who you may be familiar with. So at this time, William Scranton had grown long hair. He was sort of interested in some alternative religions, and he was in Switzerland, ironically, at the time. So he was recruited to come back to Pennsylvania to run against Faith Whittlesey for the Republican nomination, and he did defeat her in that Republican primary. Of course, though, being a maverick and non-establishment became a little bit in the mode. In 1980, when Ronald Reagan appeared to be the savior for the Republican Party and did receive the Republican Party nomination. And I think a sign of loyalty is that Ronald Reagan made the first stop in her county, Delaware County, and Faith Whittlesey prepared the rally after he announced his 1980 presidential bid. He came to her county, as you can see, Delaware County, and he and Nancy Reagan came to Fallcroft, a working class district that embodied the wing of the constituency that she was recruiting for the Republican Party, not the traditional establishment, but an outreach effort in the Republican Party to other groups like the working class. So this, of course, required her to campaign and to canvass voters to make sure that Ronald Reagan received the party nomination, and she did that. And then Pennsylvania, of course, played a key role in the election in 1980. There was a battleground state, and her role there in campaigning for Reagan all through Pennsylvania was critical in Reagan's election. Now, as you may have been reading in recent weeks, as President Barack Obama is searching for ambassadors, that in European nations, Caribbean nations, political donors are often the first. I think the editor for Vogue magazine was up for one of these spots, maybe an ambassador to one of the European countries, and Ambassador Whittlesey had not given $1 to the campaign, so you might think that she wouldn't be in line for one of these ambassadorships. But of course, she had given a lot of her effort, her blood, sweat, and tears. And so she was chosen for ambassador to Switzerland. And as I spoke with Wendy Borshort, who interviewed the ambassador candidates, and she said there were two qualities that Reagan was looking for. Knowledge of the country, and language, and culture, and commitment and loyalty to his ideas. And Faith Whittlesey had both of those. She had studied at Wells College in New York. She had studied German history, so she was familiar with the predominantly German-speaking nation, Switzerland. And she was a person who had shown loyalty to Reagan by supporting him in 1976 and consistently through 1980. So she was chosen, and here's an image of her with her three children, William, and Amy and Henry, and also the chief of protocol, Lee Annenberg, was with them. If you remember, we talked a little bit before about William Scranton, right? And he attended the signing in at the installation. And remember, he was the one who had competed with Faith Whittlesey for lieutenant governor nomination in 1978. And he came and he said, with a touch of irony, now, I'm not sure who won that election. Faith Whittlesey is going to Switzerland, and I'm on the rubber chicken circuit in Pennsylvania. So, Switzerland, the second part of my remarks, I'll talk a little bit about the role of an ambassador and Faith Whittlesey's encounter with challenges to this. Someone has said, one ambassador has said, being an ambassador is different than anything I've ever done before. It's different than anything. Being a career diplomat, a college president, CEO of a corporation. John Kenneth Galbraith, a longtime public servant for the Democratic administrations like John Kennedy, described the direction of an embassy as a unique challenge. He said the job would be inconceivable without his wife. His wife managed a large staff, the butler, the assistant bearers, the cook, the assistant cooks, the sweepers, the gardeners, the drivers, the laundrymen, and more. His wife handled the protocol activities, concern for the problems of the American community, association with wives of diplomats, cultivation of the arts. So I'm just telling you this to set you up for a scenario where Faith Whittlesey went to Switzerland as a widow in 1978. Have a spouse to handle all of these obligations that Galbraith considered essential, and that his spouse was able to help with. She supervised an embassy of 125 embassy employees, including many household staff members, on her own. Social, cultural, and political responsibilities all fell under her direct purview. So she needed really to find some assistance, and one of those assistants actually is here tonight, Susan Graff, who I spoke with, and she was very she functioned as a surrogate spouse for Faith Whittlesey, dressing and choosing the menus and appropriate outfits and flowers, and so a lot of those functions that John kind of talk about the protocol. And we'll tell you the full story, but the story of the Susan can tell it better than I can, of course, because she lived through it. But they met on the ski lift, right? And this was, of course, a famous pastime in Switzerland, skiing. And Faith Whittlesey, through the conversation, instantly recognized that this was somebody that had a job in the State Department that really didn't match her qualifications.
It was Faith's birthday, and they had a ski day, and we went up skiing. And she went up to get onto the lift. Do you mind if I?
Please.
She went to get up on the lift, and no one wanted to ride up with the ambassador. And so me being I spot an opportunity. And so I said, I rode up with Madam Ambassador, which we referred to the ambassador. And at the time I was working for USIA downstairs typing for Charlie Wick the speeches Ronald Reagan would make. So we're on the lift, and I was trying to impress the ambassador. I said, what did you think about what President Reagan said to the Teamsters last week in Maryland? And Faith, Madam Ambassador, looked at me and she said, where are you working? And so the next day I was on her staff. So
that's the benefit of having one of your subjects of your interviews. I don't have to repeat the story. Thank you, Susan. Yeah, that's and just to compliment that is one of the other State Department officials said that the ambassador is next to God for the State Department. So for Susan to do that was quite an act of courage to step in and speak to the ambassador. So skiing was a way that she met people like Susan and was able to do a sort of informal interview of some of the staff members. The Deputy Chief of Mission, James Shin, was somebody that she was able to meet in this, to know better in this way, and he and his wife. Also, of course, skiing provided U.S. nationals with a conduit to meet the Swiss. And the Army attaché, the U.S. Army attaché said, if you don't ski in Switzerland, you can't do anything. Now, perhaps he slightly exaggerated, but he said, you have no conversation in the winter with other people, because that's all they ask. What did you do last weekend, right? And where did you ski? And so I think that Whittlesey was able to recognize that the Swiss were very proud of their country and the physical beauty of their country. And I won't tell the story. It's essentially the second chapter of my book, but there was an intense and very tense U.S.-Swiss standoff, which is very similar to today, in that the United States is trying to gain access to Swiss banks and the privacy or the Swiss secrecy that is talked about. And she was able to resolve this outside of the courts, outside of the media, in part by bringing the members of the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, Department of Justice. She brought them to Switzerland. She took them in the mountains, and she allowed them to get to know a little bit about Switzerland. And she asked them to negotiate in good faith with the Swiss, which brought good results. One more thing I'll say about her as ambassador is I just talk a little bit about, besides that behind-the-scenes diplomacy, she also practiced something called public diplomacy. And this is when ambassadors will try to reach out to the newspapers, to the general public, to the leaders in business in a country. And she made this a priority of the U.S. mission in Switzerland. She wanted to know the Swiss, and she wanted the Swiss to know about America. So she visited all the 26 Swiss cantons, which are comparable to the America's 50 states. She went to local fairs and cultural events. And again, some of this maybe a spouse might have done in a for another ambassador, but she did this all herself. This was important because in 1980, Ronald Reagan's election was a shock to Europeans, right? Ronald Reagan was seen as a cowboy. Ronald Reagan was seen as someone who might inadvertently start a nuclear war with the Soviet Union. He was seen as an extreme for Europeans. And so it was important for her, someone who had an inside track into the president's character, it was important for her, she considered it important to tell them about the real Ronald Reagan. And so she used her extensive network of contacts to bring people to the U.S. residence, which I just showed here, the U.S. Embassy residence. She brought people like the Vice President George H.W. Bush. She brought the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense to Switzerland, which normally they might bypass on the European tours, but she was able to bring them to Switzerland, which made the Swiss proud that somebody with such access to Ronald Reagan would stop in Bern, which is essentially a small capital, not comparable to Paris or to London. She also brought someone from New York, Dr. Norman Lamb of Yeshiva University, Dr. John Silver of Boston University, so she brought a variety of guests. She also used culture, entertainment, music. She was an accomplished piano player from age 4 to age 21. She had spent hours of daily practice, and she knew, of course, the American folk songs, and she taught them to the Swiss. And she also learned the Swiss folk songs. And this really was really helpful in putting the Swiss at ease and allowing the Swiss, even the Swiss president, to come to the embassy and to dance with the ambassador. And I've talked to Swiss business people who have said that she really brought us together, because the Swiss, of course, are German-speaking, French-speaking, Italian-speaking, a small part Romansh-speaking, but she brought these people from different parts of Switzerland together, and they were locking arms, and the head of the army with the president and the head of multinational corporations were all swinging banjo on my knee, and so this really created an informality which allowed people to go a little deeper and understand each other as more than just in a formal way. It wasn't the only Swiss president she sang with. This was something that was common. And so I think both this public diplomacy and the private diplomacy, or the behind-the-scenes diplomacy, both contributed to her selection as Ronald Reagan's assistant for public liaison, which made her the only woman and the highest-ranking woman on the White House staff from 1983 to 1985. She was one of 18 senior staff members, and she was the one woman at the table. And I think what was really important about this was that she did not allow herself to be relegated to what we call women's issues. This was a time of where the gender gap was considered to be dangerous to Ronald Reagan. It was thought that the Republicans had a problem with women, and that the Republicans needed to reach out to women maybe by having Ronald Reagan soften his approach. Maybe they worried that Reagan spoke too much about economic issues or defense issues, and that women wouldn't relate to that. But she insisted that she, as a woman, had the right to speak about those issues as much as any other member of the senior staff, and she refused to be pigeonholed into those issues. And you might say that she turned out to be right, because in 1984, when voters had a chance to pass judgment on Ronald Reagan, even though the Democrats chose a woman for the vice presidential candidacy, Geraldine Ferraro, voters overwhelmingly supported Reagan. He won 49 states, he won 525 electoral votes, 59% of the popular vote, and he even won the women's vote. So he won 56% of women, and some reporters even started to say, actually, the gender gap seemed to be that Walter Mondale couldn't win enough men. It was a sort of reverse gender gap, people said. One more thing I'd say about her White House years is that I think she was very helpful in dismissing the image that Ronald Reagan Reagan was some kind of a cowboy, or even a historian has written recently a chapter called "Was Reagan a Dummy?" Yeah, this has kind of persisted, this image of Reagan, that he wasn't intellectual, that he was just an actor. And I think what she was able to do, and she understood, came from the same background as Ronald Reagan, that what Ronald Reagan was doing was making an appeal to the working class, who had traditionally been Democratic. And she had appealed to the Protestant evangelicals, the Catholics, the Jews, who had once been Democrats, but now were moving to the Republican Party as led by Ronald Reagan. However, Whittlesey insisted on speaking to these people, and as Director of Public Liaison, she continued to reach out to these groups because she worried that these Reagan Democrats might resort, or they had once been Roosevelt Democrats, and they might fall back into that habit of voting Democrat. So she was very active in trying to make sure that they stayed Republicans. I'll just quote her briefly. She said, "We had to show them that they counted and they mattered." And so she continued to try to speak to those groups. She tried to go around the mainstream media. Remember, this time was before cable television, before the internet. So she would try to have articles written for organizations' newsletters, or she would try to speak to local radio. This was much before these national conservative radio talk shows or cable news shows. And she was always looking for ways to speak directly with the leaders of the Catholic Church, say, like, as shown here, Cardinal O'Connor, or former Democrats, or Democrats like New York Mayor, Mayor Koch. And of course, speaking of the new media, this was a party at Rupert Murdoch's house or apartment here in New York. So what I've tried to do today is to give you a little insight into how Ambassador Whittlesey was able to really break some ground as a woman in politics, and also her importance in the Republican Party. And I thought it would be appropriate at this place for us to speak about those two issues. I just conclude then with this final thought here. This picture again is on Air Force One. And this was when Ronald Reagan went to Geneva. You'll recall that this was sort of the thawing of the Cold War, where Ronald Reagan met with Mikhail Gorbachev. And this was the beginning of a dialogue which led to the eventual breakup of the Soviet Union. And at this, there was a lot of concern at Geneva that Ronald Reagan would maybe, of course, there was always this talk that he was too old. There was this talk, right, that he couldn't stand up to Gorbachev. John Kennedy had been pushed around by Khrushchev in meeting him in Berlin in the 1960s. And there was this thought maybe that Ronald Reagan wouldn't be as strong and tough. So Ambassador Whittlesey met him on the plane, and she had a briefing guide from the Heritage Foundation. And some of the members of the administration, again, thought that maybe this was too tough. They were considered the doves of the administration. But she believed that he needed to have all the information and needed to have the Hawks view of the Cold War. So she met him on the Air Force One. She handed him the Heritage Briefing book. And of course, what was significant about this Geneva Convention is that he did hold the line with Gorbachev, and the United States was better off for it. So I'll turn the podium over to Ambassador Whittlesey. Thank you so much for coming.